On February 3, 1943, near the shattered streets of Stalingrad, a German infantryman named Karl Brenner scribbled a final note into his diary. The page, later recovered by Soviet troops, read simply, "Captured today. We are told we will be sent far away. My stomach is hollow. I have not seen bread for weeks." His words, shaky and uneven, revealed a truth common among Axis soldiers that winter, starvation had become their constant companion. They expected brutality in captivity, perhaps a crust of stale rye or watery soup. What they encountered instead, once handed over to American custody, defied every assumption. Processing began at Mediterranean ports, where groups of exhausted prisoners disembarked from Liberty ships that had carried them across the sea. Their boots clattered on American-built gangways, and the salty air was mixed with a new aroma, coffee brewing in steel urns. For men used to scorched barley substitutes, the rich scent alone was a shock. In camp kitchens along the North African coast, guards ladled out thick stew with chunks of beef, while loaves of bread, still warm, were stacked in neat rows. A quartermaster record shows daily rations averaging 2,800 calories, more than most German officers received even at the front. Prisoners sat in stunned silence, chewing slowly, hardly believing that the enemy wasted such food on captives. The voyage inland revealed more. Trains whisked the prisoners through American-controlled territories at speeds unimaginable on bomb-damaged European rails. One officer later described his astonishment at a locomotive pulling 120 cars without faltering. The rhythmic clank of wheels, the whistle echoing across valleys, and the smell of coal smoke etched into memory the vast difference in infrastructure. Even the ride itself felt like abundance. Padded seats, electric lights overhead, and stops where American soldiers disembarked to buy sandwiches wrapped in paper. The prisoners whispered among themselves that the Allies did not ration comfort. Arrival in the United States magnified the contrast. Camps in Texas, Kansas, and Georgia spread across open land, surrounded by neat barbed wire fences, but equipped with barracks lit by steady electricity. At night, bulbs glowed without dimming, while ceiling fans spun lazily in the southern heat. Axis soldiers used to blackout curtains, and cold stoves could not comprehend the casual use of power. One diary entry from a captured officer in 1943 recorded, "They switch on light as though it costs nothing." In Germany, power plants bombed and strained by shortages forced entire towns into darkness. In America, prisoners found even their confinement illuminated. Food remained the most unforgettable shock. Breakfast trays often held eggs, toast with butter, and steaming mugs of coffee. Some camps even served oatmeal sweetened with sugar or molasses. Midday meals offered beef stew, potatoes, carrots, and milk poured from metal pitchers. Supper brought pork chops or turkey with bread. The smell of roasting meat drifted across compounds, mingling with the yeasty aroma from camp bakeries. One Italian soldier admitted in interrogation that he had not tasted fresh fruit in over a year, then wept when handed an orange. The abundance seemed less like war and more like some dream. Newspapers distributed in the camps told of U.S. agricultural surpluses, 4 billion bushels of corn, 2.3 billion gallons of milk, and wheat yields surpassing 1.2 billion bushels in 1943. Prisoners read such figures with disbelief. In Axis territories, civilians queued for hours for half a loaf, while children grew gaunt on rations of ersatz margarine. The prisoners' own senses confirmed the headlines. They saw guards toss away uneaten crusts, smelled coffee grounds dumped from pots, and watched as milk soured in the sun without concern. Waste itself testified to a surplus that warfare could not dent. Some tried to rationalize what they saw. A few officers whispered that Americans spoiled their men, that too much food would weaken discipline. Yet every train whistle, every full tray, every sturdy guard standing watch contradicted that theory. Comfort here did not breed weakness, it bred confidence. American soldiers marched with bellies full, carried rifles cleaned with ample oil, and fought knowing supply would not fail. The prisoners, in contrast, carried memories of half-empty mess tins and boots patched with wire. Even small sensory details carried weight. The hiss of steam from camp kitchens, the clatter of metal trays, The sweet tang of jam spread across thick bread. All were reminders of disparity. Prisoners fingered letters from home describing black markets and hunger, then looked at their own rations of meat and milk. Some broke down quietly, realizing their families suffered while their captors fed them better than their own government had. Numbers repeated like drumbeats. In 1943 alone, America's farms produced over 23 billion pounds of beef, 2 billion pounds of butter, and millions of eggs shipped daily to soldiers and civilians alike. Quartermaster accounts revealed that each U.S. serviceman received 4,000 calories per day, nearly double the ration of a German infantryman. Axis soldiers in captivity could not escape the comparison. They had fought hungry, while their enemies fought on full stomachs. Human encounters deepened the revelation. Chaplains handed out Bibles and encouraged letter writing. Red Cross parcels delivered chocolate and cigarettes. Luxuries long vanished in Europe. On holidays, camps served turkeys stuffed with bread. The air filled with sage and pepper, while prisoners sang familiar songs in their own language. Guards permitted Christmas trees in barracks, strings of popcorn and paper ornaments bright against wooden walls. These gestures unsettled many more than harsh treatment ever could. Abundance wrapped in dignity was a weapon of persuasion. Some resisted. Hardliners muttered that it was all an illusion, that the Americans showed only their best to break morale. Yet day after day the evidence persisted. Trainloads of flour arrived without fail. Convoys of trucks passed camp fences carrying canned goods by the ton. Radios crackled with swing music powered by grids that never faltered. No speech from Berlin could erase the smell of coffee in the morning or the taste of butter melting into warm bread. By mid-1943, a subtle shift was visible. Prisoners who once boasted of German discipline now spoke in whispers about American plenty. A few even admitted that food, electricity, and comfort were as decisive as tanks or planes. One diary captured the mood. "We thought hunger proved strength. Here I see that strength is having no hunger at all." And yet these prisoners had only witnessed abundance as consumers, as observers behind wire. Their bellies were full, their barracks lit, their senses overwhelmed. But the next stage would bring them into the fields, mills, and factories themselves. With their own hands, they would discover whether this surplus was illusion or reality. What they witnessed next would test not just their stomachs, but their deepest beliefs. For Axis soldiers confined behind American barbed wire in 1943, the first shock had been food. Bread, coffee, and meat flowed so freely it felt like mockery. But as weeks passed and newspapers circulated through the camps, a deeper truth emerged. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of an industrial machine so vast, so electrified, and so relentless that it seemed to operate outside the boundaries of war. Shipyards, factories, and power grids revealed a rhythm of production, unlike anything prisoners had ever imagined. The shipyards stood as the first towering proof. Liberty ships designed to be built fast and cheap slid into the water in endless procession. Yard logs recorded launches every few days. The SS Robert E. Peary had gone from keel to christening in just under 5 days, an event prisoners read about in astonished disbelief. Sparks cascaded from welders' torches like fiery waterfalls. Cranes swung steel plates into place, and whistles marked shift changes with the punctuality of clockwork. In 1943 alone, American yards produced more than 18 million tons of shipping. By comparison, German yards barely replaced their losses, and Italian docks, crippled by shortages, produced little more than patrol craft. The aircraft carriers impressed even more. Newspapers posted in camp halls carried photos of Essex-class decks, stretching longer than football fields. Each displaced 27,000 tons and carried up to 90 aircraft. In a single year, 6 of these floating fortresses joined the fleet. Japanese officers among the prisoners whispered that their own shipyards in Yokosuka or Kure could not manage such speed even in peacetime. For Axis captives, the sight of cranes looming over steel hulls, painted in glossy photographs, confirmed what they had once dismissed as propaganda. Factories inland completed the picture. Willow Run in Michigan poured out bombers at the rate of 1 per hour. The arsenal of democracy in Detroit produced tanks by the tens of thousands. The Warren Arsenal alone, sending 22,000 Shermans into service by war's end. The sensory details leapt from descriptions in camp newsletters. Presses pounding so loud the floor vibrated, conveyor belts rattling like endless chains, and the smell of hot oil clinging to the air. Even the casual photographs of women in overalls welding fuselages spoke volumes. In Axis territories, factories limped on under blackout conditions. In America, they roared day and night. Electricity underpinned it all. The Tennessee Valley Authority delivered 17 billion kilowatt-hours in 1944, feeding aluminum smelters and shipyards alike. Hydroelectric turbines thundered, and transmission towers marched across plains in lines that vanished at the horizon. For prisoners, the shock came in simpler form. Camp lights burned every night without faltering. Radios played jazz until midnight. Ceiling fans spun lazily in southern heat, and water heaters provided hot baths weekly. Back home, cities rationed kerosene and candles. Here, abundance was not only seen but felt in every glowing bulb and every hum of machinery. Wages and consumer life brought another layer of realization. Camp magazines printed stories about shipyard welders earning more than $50 a week. Workers spent freely on bicycles, radios, and phonographs. Advertisements showed refrigerators and washing machines waiting in store windows. Luxuries beyond the dreams of families in Bremen or Naples. The smell of glossy ink on those pages was as convincing as the numbers. To Axis officers, it was staggering to imagine a society fighting a global war, yet still promising its citizens post-war appliances. Food production made the industrial miracle personal. Farms yielded over 23 billion pounds of beef in 1943, along with 2 billion pounds of butter and 1 billion bushels of wheat. Surpluses filled warehouses and silos. Even with rationing, Americans consumed more than 3,000 calories daily. Prisoners watched trucks roll past fences loaded with canned peaches, flour sacks, and crates of milk. They smelled fruit fermenting when shipments spoiled, watched guards throw away bread crusts without a thought, and realized that hunger was not universal. Waste itself was proof. The many reveals accumulated. POW in Kansas saw grain poured into elevators that rose like cathedrals, their walls humming as conveyors rattled upward. Another assigned near a lumberyard watched piles of boards discarded because they were warped. Axis soldiers compared it to home, where families scavenged splinters for fuel. If this was how America treated its excess, then production must be beyond calculation. The arithmetic became inescapable. In 1943, the United States built 96,000 aircraft, while Germany struggled to produce 25,000 and Italy fewer than 3,000. Steel production reached 89 million tons, more than the combined output of Germany and Japan. Oil output surpassed 1.5 billion barrels. Every figure written on camp bulletin boards was a hammer blow against ideology. Axis prisoners realized they were not simply facing soldiers with rifles. They were facing an economy larger than empires. Some clung to defiance. They muttered that American decadence would collapse under its own weight, that strikes or politics would slow production. Yet each week more headlines appeared. Another Liberty ship launched, another Essex-class commissioned, another field harvested. Guards joked about overtime shifts and fresh coffee in break rooms. The casualness of plenty undermined every whispered doubt. Human encounters gave the statistics a human face. Guards spoke of families with cars and radios. Chaplains mentioned charity drives for civilians abroad. Even small talk about baseball or wages reflected confidence born from security. Axis soldiers who once believed hardship forged strength now questioned whether true strength came from never knowing hunger or cold. By late 1943, the conclusion settled heavily. Comfort here was not weakness but endurance. Factories did not pause. Farms did not fail, shipyards did not sleep. Axis prisoners sitting on bunks under humming lights realized they were watching a nation that could fight a war and still live in surplus. And yet up to this point, they had only observed. They had eaten the food, read the numbers, and seen the photographs. But soon, labor assignments would take them into the fields, mills, and repair shops. With their own hands, they would confirm whether abundance was illusion or truth. What they witnessed next would challenge not only their stomachs, but their very beliefs about the world. By 1944, Axis soldiers held in American camps had grown accustomed to the shock of abundance. They had eaten full rations, read newspapers boasting of production, and seen trains carrying food and steel with unstoppable rhythm. Yet observation alone could be dismissed as propaganda. The real turning point came when prisoners were sent to work. In fields, factories, and forests, their own sweat confirmed what their eyes and ears had hinted. America's surplus was not illusion. It was reality, replicated in every acre and assembly line. Farm labor was the most common detail. At dawn, columns of prisoners marched under guard into vast fields. The smell of dew on grass mixed with the sharp tang of gasoline from tractors already plowing. Many prisoners had grown up on small European farms, where harvest meant days of bending by hand. Now they watched combines roar across rows, harvesting in an hour what would take a village in Germany or Italy a week. Records show U.S. farmers produced over 4 billion bushels of corn in 1944, and prisoners loading grain into silos towering like fortresses could see that figure embodied before them. Some prisoners worked orchards. In Washington state, apple trees stretched beyond sight. Crates filled the air with the sweet smell of ripening fruit. Axis soldiers picked until their hands were sticky, then watched truckloads rumble away, bound for canneries. The waste stunned them. Bruised apples littered the ground left to rot. In Italy, families bartered for scraps of dried figs. Here, abundance spilled unguarded onto the soil. One prisoner whispered to another, "If this is harvest for enemies, what must their soldiers receive?" Forestry details brought similar revelations. In Minnesota and Oregon, POWs pushed saws through pine while the crisp scent of resin clung to their clothes. Diesel trucks groaned under loads of timber, headed for mills where conveyor belts rattled endlessly. A single prisoner crew cut more than 12,000 cords of wood in one season. Camp logs record. They marveled that offcuts were burned in heaps. In Germany, bombed-out cities salvaged splinters for firewood. The contrast was not theoretical. It lay in every discarded branch. Factories offered an even harsher comparison. Though barred from sensitive military plants, prisoners were sent to canneries, textile mills, and repair shops. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. Presses hammering, belts clattering, foremen's whistles echoing. The smell of hot oil and machine grease hung heavy. A German naval engineer, captured in North Africa, recorded his shock at seeing dozens of spare engines waiting in rows. "In Hamburg, we fought to save one damaged motor," he wrote. "Here they replace rather than repair. Humane touches intertwined with the labor." Red Cross parcels arrived with chocolate, soap, and writing paper. Chaplains visited camps, sometimes holding services in German or Italian. At Christmas, turkeys roasted by the ton-filled kitchens with the smell of sage and smoke. Prisoners sat before trays laden with bread, stuffing, and pies. One officer admitted that his family back home had not tasted meat in over a year. The irony of abundance in captivity weighed heavier than any lecture. Medical care struck even deeper. Infirmaries offered sulfa drugs and, by 1945, penicillin. A prisoner who collapsed with pneumonia was placed in a clean bed under electric heaters, a nurse checking his pulse with calm efficiency. He later confessed that such care would not have been available to him in Berlin. The antiseptic sting of alcohol, the steady hum of electricity, the scent of laundered sheets, all clashed violently with memories of bombed hospitals running on candlelight. Education programs added another layer. Camps offered English classes, mathematics, even agriculture and engineering courses. Chalk scraped across blackboards, mingling with the smell of ink from textbooks. A young Italian soldier studied soil science and realized that American crop yields were not simply luck, but research. Others learned mechanics, staring at diagrams of conveyor systems. Knowledge was being handed freely to prisoners, itself a product of surplus. Some resisted. Hardliners whispered that kindness was deception. They punished men who praised America too openly, yet cracks widened daily. A man might rail against decadence at night, then spend his day stacking crates of flour so plentiful that torn sacks were discarded. He might denounce democracy but still taste butter on bread, while his family in Cologne wrote of boiling nettles for soup. Each shift in field or factory eroded ideology more effectively than propaganda. Many reveals deepened the lesson. POW in Kansas saw potatoes piled so high, they formed mounds taller than men, the earthy smell saturating the air. Another in Michigan watched milk spilled into ditches when deliveries ran late, the sweet sour odor clinging to his boots. They knew children in Europe starved. Here, waste itself seemed infinite. The numbers echoed what their senses confirmed. In 1944, U.S. canneries processed over 3 billion pounds of vegetables. Ammunition plants turned out 40 billion rounds of cartridges. Steel production hit 89 million tons, dwarfing Axis totals. Prisoners stacking crates or repairing tools saw those tallies embodied in the endless movement of trucks and trains around them. The arithmetic was not an abstraction. It was labor, sweat, and muscle. Human encounters reinforced the shift. Farmers sometimes handed prisoners apples from their own orchards. Guards occasionally shared cigarettes or explained baseball rules. A chaplain presided over the funeral of a prisoner, American soldiers standing in silence as the coffin lowered. The thud of earth, the scent of pine boards, and the dignity of the service unsettled many more than cruelty ever could. By early 1945, diaries reflected the change. Prisoners lay awake under clean blankets, listening to jazz on radios, haunted by memories of blacked-out cities back home. One wrote, "We thought hunger was strength. Here I see strength as having no hunger at all." It was an admission born not of lectures but of labor. For soldiers who had once marched with empty mess tins, the lesson was brutal. America's war effort was not about scarcity or sacrifice, but about scale. Every bushel they harvested, every log they cut, every engine they saw proved that the United States could fight a global war and still waste more than the Axis could produce. Yet even these revelations were only fragments. They had confirmed abundance through their own work. But the ultimate proof would come not in silos or mills, but on the battlefield. Soon they would read reports of convoys stretching to the horizon, fleets landing armies supplied without pause, and campaigns fueled by oceans of food and oil. What they witnessed next would reveal that America's plenty was not only survival, it was decisive victory. By 1945, the lesson was no longer hidden in fields or factories. It thundered across oceans and filled the skies. Axis prisoners who had once marveled at camp rations now read headlines of Allied armies fed and armed at scales they could hardly comprehend. What they had tasted in bread and coffee was multiplied into fleets, divisions, and campaigns. The macro proof arrived not in rumors, but in overwhelming arithmetic. The United States could supply victory faster than its enemies could wage war. D-Day showed it first. On June 6, 1944, 156,000 Allied troops landed in Normandy, carried by more than 7,000 vessels. Liberty ships unloaded 100,000 tons of supplies in the first week alone. Quartermaster records reveal that by the end of the summer, 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of cargo had crossed the Channel. For Axis prisoners behind American fences, the numbers were posted in newspapers pinned to bulletin boards. They stared in silence. One muttered, "Our U-boats could never sink so much." Another added bitterly, "This is not war of soldiers. It is war of bread." The Ardennes campaign reinforced the point. During the German offensive in December 1944, winter storms delayed some supplies, but convoys continued to arrive at Antwerp and Cherbourg. Allied depots stored gasoline in jerrycans stacked 3 stories high. 60,000 tons delivered each week despite snow. German panzers ran dry in the forests of Belgium, while American trucks rolled forward. Prisoners reading the figures in camp papers recognized the symbolism. Battles were not lost only in trenches, but in ration lines. Okinawa revealed it at sea. Nearly 1,300 American ships crowded the waters offshore in spring 1945. Radar-guided guns defended them, but it was the constant flow of supplies that sustained them. Oilers pumped millions of gallons into carrier task forces, while cargo ships unloaded 544,000 tons during the campaign. Kamikazes struck with fury, yet replacements and repairs flowed in faster than destruction could spread. Axis officers confined in American camps could only imagine the spectacle, an armada so large that the horizon itself seemed made of steel. The numbers painted a relentless picture. In 1944 alone, U.S. farms harvested 4 billion bushels of corn, 23 billion pounds of beef, and 2 billion pounds of butter. Factories produced 96,000 aircraft and 40 billion cartridges. Shipyards launched 18 million tons of new shipping. Steel output soared past 89 million tons. Oil fields pumped 1.7 billion barrels of fuel. Each statistic was a strike against the Axis belief that hardship built endurance. America's comfort had become a weapon. Prisoners recalled the small details of captivity: eggs at breakfast, coffee in mugs, butter melting on bread, and realized those meals were echoes of something larger. The same kitchens that roasted turkeys for POWs also provisioned Liberty ships bound for Europe. The same flour sacks delivered to camps filled depots in England. They saw that their own rations were not anomalies, but extensions of a society producing beyond measure. Comfort in captivity was a byproduct of industrial surplus, and surplus had become the deciding factor of the war. After surrender, the contrast deepened. Returning officers found German cities gutted by firebombs, Italian towns stripped by shortages, and Japanese neighborhoods leveled by air raids. Families recounted winters of hunger, scraping weeds for soup or burning furniture for heat. Letters from home had prepared them, but the ruins struck harder than words. In memory, they compared those ruins with the hum of American barracks fans, the glow of light bulbs, the taste of oranges at Christmas. The gap between abundance and scarcity seemed immeasurable. Historians at Nuremberg asked senior commanders why the Axis had lost. Many admitted what prisoners had already sensed. They had been outbuilt, outfed, and outsupplied. Albert Speer confessed that once American production reached full stride, Germany's defeat was only a matter of time. Japanese officers acknowledged that carriers and convoys replaced faster than their fleets could sink them. Even Italian generals conceded that fighting hungry soldiers against well-fed ones had been folly. The legacy of that abundance stretched beyond surrender. Liberty ships carried not only weapons but also relief supplies. Grain sacks stamped USA arrived in Europe to feed civilians, including families of the very men once held in camps. The smell of flour dust in ruined bakeries, the taste of bread baked again in cities like Naples or Bremen, carried a different symbolism. America's production lines had crushed the Axis in war and now rebuilt the peace. Epilogue. The story of Axis soldiers astonished by fresh bread. Coffee and meat in 1943 was never just about food. It was about proof. Proof that strength lies not only in courage but in the capacity to provide. America's victory came through abundance turned into endurance, through convoys that never stopped, and through dignity extended even to captives. Wars are not won by hunger, but by plenty. And if you found this journey revealing, subscribe to join us for the next exploration of how ordinary comforts became extraordinary weapons in shaping history.